about their attitude to the government, about their level of life, would they agree or disagree, and he was detained for this immediately. And that's why I put my documents instead of him to become president of the country. So Belarus is the country where the most journalists are in prison per capita in the world. So in Belarus, about 40 journalists are recognized as political prisoners, and this number is growing. About 3,000 media outlets and websites are recognized as extremists. So people in Belarus, while they're reading alternative news or looking for alternative information, they also can be recognized as extremists. So people, are afraid even, to read or to like or to retweet or whatever. So, and it's tools of tyrants, it's tools of dictators. They're really scared of opinion of people, and they want to suppress people. For them, not even, have a wish to watch something else than just propaganda, TV or media.
So there's like the official opinion and what the people think they don't express.
Absolutely.
They don't dare to express that freely. Okay, there will be even so-called parliamentary elections in Belarus. Do you see any chance of change in your home country or for change?
So this so-called, as you correctly said, parliamentary elections, it's nothing but farce, imitation, theater, circus, but has nothing to do with elections. And people in Belarus understand this. And these so-called elections cannot be turning point in Belarus. So people might sacrifice their freedom and lives in vain, like participating or not participating in this election. So we are asking people not to vote at all, because it doesn't change anything in our country. Lukashenko put his pocket parliament, designated his pocket parliament, and will not change anything. But we are asking people to be involved in politics through different means, to continue resist undergroundly, to read honest news, to deliver news from inside Belarus to outlets that had to relocate after 2020. We actually call Belarusian people our national intelligence or public intelligence or people's intelligence. People now in Belarus, they are our local journalists. Though they don't have such profession, they inform us about the situation.
They collect information.
Absolutely.
And inform the opposition. Yeah?
Send it to media in exile, because in Belarus now only media can't work at all, and those media that have been relocated since 2020, they can broadcast through YouTube, through Telegram channels, so we don't have opportunity to broadcast on TV. It's fully under influence of regime, but still we are looking for new opportunities. We're using TikTok, all the possible platforms to talk to people.
Okay. Thank you, Svetlana. A question now to Joe. Joe, the job of journalists is, of course, also to hold powerful people to account, to report about problems and so on. But at the same time now, even though we are doing this, we see the rise of autocrats. So are we journalists failing?
I wouldn't say that journalists are failing per se. I think the description of the deterioration of the environment for free speech, free press, and independent organizations in a number of societies is connected with the decline of free media, and an independent free press is an essential component of having a free society. But having an independent free press obviously is not a sufficient guarantee to produce a free society, and the reason that you see a lot of repression of journalists, the jailing of journalists, the killing of journalists, the pressure on institutions that produce journalism in multiple societies around the world is precisely because they are a contributor to a free and democratic society. So I don't think that you can say that journalists have failed because there's a deterioration in democracy. I think that you're seeing repression of journalists and journalism precisely because of the same trend that you're describing here, which is authoritarian leaders are taking advantage of multiple situations, including cultural divisions, political divisions, to repress free expression in multiple societies around the world, to control the independent free press, or to take away the independence of the press. In other words, I see open discussion, open reporting as a contributor to a greater free expression and freedom in society. But I also see the same trend that you're describing in terms of repression as hurting and repressing the free press.
So it's more difficult now for journalists to do their job nowadays, yeah? Do you feel this also with your journalists in certain regions?
I think it's more difficult for journalists to do their job than it has been, certainly in the last 20 or 30 years in multiple places around the world. It's certainly more difficult to, as an international news organization, to dispatch our journalists. The safety situation, the credentialing of journalists around the world has become significantly more difficult. I mean, today, most big international news organizations have had to radically reduce the staff that they have in Russia and in China. So those traditionally are two of the biggest postings for international journalists around the world. Both of them have been radically reduced. It's become more difficult to be an international journalist or a domestic journalist in India, the world's largest democracy. I think we're seeing deterioration essentially everywhere, and it's connected with the same trend that you're describing. I do think that even in that environment, good journalism domestically and globally is contributing to people's awareness of the threat that we're describing today, and will continue to contribute to that. And I'm not entirely pessimistic that we can see, some degree of positive change. We heard a little bit about the situation in Poland. The situation in Poland has shifted recently with the Law and Justice Party losing its control over all the institutions of Polish society, and seeing the opposition or a group of opposition parties come into power. I think we've seen some progress in places like Colombia. And I believe, there can continue, as long as journalists are doing the job of exposing corruption, showing the effects of collusion that exist when authoritarian leaders and their cronies come into powerful positions, that will have an impact over time, and will help inform people's decision-making about what kind of government they want and the kind of participation they want in their own societies.
Thank you, Joe. Tirana, you described the global landscape, the difficult global landscape, very well. What kind of strategies should we develop to tackle the rise of autocrats, for example?
I mean, I think that, Joe was just saying that, journalists, and we were talking about civil society, plays a role in this, and we need to ensure that we're not just relying on what is happening in countries as crises are emerging, as rights are actually are regressing. We need to ensure that the friends of those governments, whether they be economic friends, trade friends, we need to be leveraging whatever power we have to hold those governments to account. And there's another disturbing trend that we're seeing across the global landscape, and that is governments throwing their hands in the air, saying, well, it's all just too hard. And that's just not true. There are ways to engage before we hit the crisis point. There are canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, early indicators. As I discussed, when you start seeing attacks on women's rights, reproductive rights, the LGBT community, migrants, refugees, those are the first indications of the rise of an anti-rights agenda, and often the early indications of authoritarianism, and they can emerge in democracies. That's when action needs to be taken, because if you do not hold governments to account for those sort of regressions, then they go one step further because they feel emboldened, and then they start going for the institutions, then they start going for the free press, then they start going for the independence of the judiciary. Then they'll start going for silencing political opposition. And that is when we end up in crisis. That's when we move from a regression in human rights to full-blown autocracy. And that is not a trend that is inevitable. That can be changed through the actions of governments across the world and prioritizing human rights, open societies, and democracy.
Ladies and gentlemen, you can ask one or two questions if you like, but first of all, I would like another question too, then I come to you, to Svetlana. Svetlana, holding the governments to account, do you feel enough support by the international community? Because you just described how difficult it is also for you personally and for all the people in Belarus. So what kind of support do you wish for?
First of all, I want to underline that, of course, Belarus now not in like deep focus, because so many events are happening in the world, and we know that attention span is rather short in the world. And of course, it's our task to increase attention to our country, to the situation, to abuse of human rights and political prisoners, so on and so forth. What we want from the world, we want from political world, we want decisiveness, because we see how weakness of institutions, or undecisiveness of politicians, or absence of political will is perceived as weakness by dictators, and they think they feel impunity for their actions.
They can do what they want.
Absolutely, without any attention. That's why they ruin media, first of all, in dictatorship, for the world not to see what's going on in countries. In Belarus, every day in our country, 15, 20 people are being detained for their anti-regime or anti-war position. Does the world know about this? No, because we don't have journalists on the ground. And so that's why we know about this, but we can't show pictures. And the world sometimes is thinking only, on the ground of beautiful pictures, or pictures of atrocities. But if they don't have anything to visualize, they think that the problem doesn't exist. So that international media is so important for the cases like in Belarus. You have to collaborate with democratic forces, to ask our opinion, to to highlight, the detention in our country, to highlight abuses of human rights. And when Belarus is in media, it means that it will be on the tables of politicians. And what we ask for more political and economical pressure on the regime. We see how Russia and Belarusian regime using each other just to create loopholes in sanctions, and they continue to trade with the world. Then we need accountability. Lukashenko committed many crimes in our country. It's crimes against humanity, it's torturing people, migration crisis, hijacking airplane, participation in the war, abduction of Ukrainian children. And we are begging for launching a special investigation on his crimes. Mm-hmm. Why? It's still not, it hasn't been done yet. Yeah. Why? It's about, efficiency of international institutions. Then we need support to people, support to civil society. We can sustain, but we need to win this war. And we need assistance, first of all, to our media. And now when I see that in Belarus, assistance to media is from the democratic world is reduced, I'm shocked, because how can we deliver news about Belarus to you if we don't have enough support and enough assistance for our media? And it's also commitment. Belarus chose, Belarusian people actually chose a European path of development, and we need support of this path from international media and, of course, from European politicians.
Okay. Thank you, Svetlana. Now, please, your question. And
do you see generational differences as to...
I think you get a mic.
Do you see generational differences as to where the public goes for their information? And certain generations may go to the New York Times or, press, and others will go to influencers and bloggers, or just certain TV stations that you can hear two different opinions, and you're talking to someone you really don't know if they're on the right planet or not. So, respectful journalism is important, but are they going to the source?
is this question to Joe or? Okay. Joe, would you like to take it?
Sure. I mean, yes, trying to broaden the demographics of the readership for quality information is the obligation and the interest of every major news organization, and trying to reach younger readers or those who are not as inclined to come to traditional sources is one of the things we're working hard on. I don't think that there is a barrier to good quality information from leading news organizations per se. I do think you're right that the traditional habits of reading, certainly print newspapers is something that is now confined to a very specific, generation of people and is not a tradition that has continued. But even navigating directly to websites and going to broadcast television outlets also is something that's sort of demographically differentiated. I do think when we have, put our journalism into forms that work for a broader audience, a younger demographic, on platforms like TikTok or Instagram, the response to it tends to be pretty good. There is a hunger for good quality information. There's a hunger to know more about the journalists who are producing it. And being more transparent and open and producing in the forms that people of every generation want to consume their news and information in is kind of an obligation on us because the audience is there for it.
Thank you, Joe. We can take one more very brief question because we have to come to an end then, and we have very important closing remarks as well.
Hello, I'm Sajini. I'm with Global Shaper from Sri Lanka. My question is, I'm a Sri Lankan and our Prime Minister is here and the Prime Minister of Vietnam is here. So there have been serious issues about freedom of expression in Sri Lanka, especially very recently we had this online safety bill coming which hindered the freedom of expression deeply. And in Vietnam, I got to know at COP where certain climate lawyers have been arrested, still in jail. So have there been discussions between the NGOs or the human rights bodies here and these leaders who ultimately kind of make these decisions in spaces like this where you kind of mingle all together? I want to know what steps have been taken. Thank you.
I think it's very important that we have this discussion here now. That just shows that there are discussions. But Tirana, probably you like to take that?
Sure. You will not maybe be surprised that certain leaders who tend to have less rights respecting or autocratic tendencies aren't as willing as to find time in their schedules to meet with civil society and human rights organisations. That said, we do meet with governments. Not just here, this is a particular fora, but consistently through the year, particularly not only after bills have actually been introduced, but before, as soon as the draft legislation goes into action. International human rights organisations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International and others will be working with Sri Lankan organisations, Vietnamese human rights organisations who are under extraordinary pressure by these repressive governments because they are trying to hold them to account, to actually engage in discussions, speak to lawmakers, and actually stop the laws before they pass. One of the things I would say about these laws that we're seeing in Sri Lanka, it's not just about Sri Lanka. It is across Asia, it is across Latin America, it is even in Australia, the UK and the US. There are these permissive broad laws all introduced for our security, which essentially can be used by governments to silence dissent and critics through online discussions and freedom of speech online. So we need to work and keep a very close eye on ensuring that we stop this regression in the digital space. It's incredibly harmful.
Yes, we see this in Turkey as well just recently, for example. Yeah. Thank you very much, Tirana, Svetlana, and Joe. And now we come to our closing remarks, and I would like to ask Taji Rahmani to join us on the stage here with his translator. And Mr. Rahmani is an Iranian journalist, writer, political activist, and his wife, I'm sure you know, Narges Mohammadi, is actually being held in prison in Iran, in the notorious Evin prison. and she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in fighting for women's rights, and her teenage children accepted the award for her last year, and so please.
با سلام خدمت همه شما.
Hi to everyone and thank you for inviting me here.
آزادی بیان، جامعه مدنی و سرمایه جهانی شده. در جهانی جهانی شده زندگی می‌کنیم. مرزها دچار تغییر و تعریف شدیدی شدند. مشخص نیست مرز ملی کجاست. سرمایه جهانی با رسانه‌ها دچار تحول و تغییر شده است. برخی از این تغییرات به دلیل نامشخص بودن نگران کننده هستند، اما در حال انجامند. مدل‌های اقتصادی و نظرات فلسفی توان توضیح روابط و مناسبات اجتماعی جدید را ندارد. به عبارتی تکنیک از تفکر جلو زده است. تفکر و ایده باید برای کنترل این تکنولوژی چاره‌ای بیندیشد. اجلاس‌های سالانه در داوودز این ادعا را با خود حمل می‌کند، اما آیا موفق بوده است؟ جواب را به متخصصان باز می‌دارم.
How supporting free expression and civil society in Iran benefits the world. Globalization has changed the lines between nations and reshapes the world. The media and the flow of money have created new realities and challenge. Technology has changed the way we interact and relate to each other. Our old theories and concepts cannot keep us with this change. We need to think of new ways to manage and use technology wisely. The world leaders who met in Davos every year say they want to do this, but are they really doing like this? I will let the expert judge that. Today I want to talk about how freedom of speech, civil society and globalized capital affect my own region and my own country. I have seen two eras of intellectual life in Iran, and I know the first era from the story of those who live it. Freedom of speech in our country has always been threatened. Let me start from the 17 years ago to make the problem well understood.
عرصه بحثم را به منطقه و کشور خودم می‌آورم با موضوع آزادی بیان و جامعه. من شاهد دو دوره روشنفکری در ایران بودم. دوره اول را درک کردم. بعضی از راویان دست اول را شنیدم. آزادی بیان در کشور ما همیشه تهدید شده است. بگذارید از 70 سال پیش شروع کنم تا مشکل بهتر درک شود. بعد از کودتای 28 مرداد 1332 کشور ما دچار حوادثی سخت بوده که اون را از توسعه و صلح دور کرده. بعد از اون کودتا رابطه ایران با غرب دچار نوسان شد و امروز هم حکومت استبدادی بر اساس تبعیض در ایران بنا شده است و گذار از این حکومت ضروری است. این حکومت آزادی بیان را جرم می‌داند و نهادهای مدنی را سرکوب می‌کند. از تعارض سیاست‌های غرب در منطقه استفاده می‌کند تا دیکتاتوری خود را تحکیم کند. مردم ما صلح، توسعه می‌خواهند. آزادی بیان به دموکراسی کمک می‌کند.
After the coup d'etat of August 1953, our country has faced challenging events that have kept it from development and peace. Since then, Iran's relations with the West have been fluctuating. Today, the government is authoritarian and built on discrimination, and transitioning from it's necessary. This government criminalizes freedom of speech and suppress civil institutions. It exploits the contradiction and failure of Western policies in the region to stabilize his own dictatorship, increasing instability in the whole region. We dream of a peaceful, prosperous, and democratic Iran. We know that without freedom of speech, there is no democracy possible.
آزادی بیان دروازه دموکراسی است. من به خاطر این بسته بودن دروازه 14 سال زندان کشیدم و 12 سال است که تبعید هستم. همسرم نرگس محمدی سالهاست به علت فعالیت مدنی در زندان است. البته این سرنوشت ما تنها نیست، بلکه سرنوشت مشترک هر ایرانی است که به آزادی بیان اعتقاد دارد. اما چرا چنین است؟ آزادی بیان بستر و حامی و عینی میخواهند و اون بستر جامعه مدنی و نهادهای مدنی مستقل از دولت است. بدون آزادی، بدون نهاد مدنی و جامعه مدنی آزادی بیان ممکن نیست. اما حکومت‌ها در منطقه ما با آزادی بیان مخالفند، پس نهادهای مدنی را سرکوب می‌کنند. ما در ایران نهادهای مدنی مقاوم داریم که در مقابل حکومت می‌ایستند، اما حکومت‌ها در منطقه از تعارضی استفاده می‌کنند که منافع دولت‌های غربی ایجاد می‌کند. زمانی نفت و انرژی ارزان و بازار مصرف برای حفظ ثبات سیاسی اقتصادی در غرب عامل اصلی تعامل و تقابل با حکومت‌های ما در منطقه بود. در این مواجهه جامعه مدنی ما زیر فشار می‌رفت. این قاعده که حکومت‌های منطقه چه مخالف و چه موافق با غرب هستند جای تعجب دارد که نتیجهش قربانی شدن آزادی مردم ما.
We have paid a high price for speaking our minds. I personally spent 40 years in jail and 12 years in exile. My wife, Narges Mohammadi, is still behind bars for her civic work, but we are not alone. Many Iranians share our struggle and our hope for freedom of speech in Iran. What is the reason for this? Freedom of speech cannot exist without a strong and concrete foundation. That foundation is a vibrant civil society and a civil institution that is free from government or state interference. But why it's so? Freedom of speech needs a supportive environment and strong foundation, and that foundation is a vibrant civil society. Freedom of speech and security depend on a strong and independent civil society and public institution. But the government in our region do not want that, so they crush any civic voice or organization. In Iran, we keep fighting back. We have periodic movements that call for a democratic and accountable government. The government in our region exploit conflict that serves the interest of the West in their own advantage. The West has too frequently only cared about cheap oil and energy to keep its own stability and prosperity. It did not care how it dealt with government in our region, whether friendly or hostile. This harmed our civil society and our rights. We need to pay attention to this pattern of this dictatorship and oppression in Iran, no matter who supports it, because it hurts our freedom of our people.
Okay.
آزادی بیان به قدرت یافتن جامعه مدنی نیاز دارد. چاره کار جنگ و تحریم مردم نیست. چاره کار تقویت مردم و جامعه مدنی است. مثلا مردم ما به آزادی اینترنت نیاز دارند تا جلوی انحصار حکومت را بگیرند. در این مورد به ما کمک کنید. شما را به تغییر راهبردی برای آزادی بیان و اتخاذ سیاست‌های مهم در منطقه دعوت می‌کنیم. ما همه سوار یک قطار هستیم. کمک کنیم به آزادی و دموکراسی در ایران و منطقه ما. کمک کنیم تا همه امنیت داشته باشیم.
To finish and to conclude, in Iran, to have freedom of speech, we need a strong and active civil society. The answer is not to harm or isolate our people with war and sanction, but to support them and their civic organization. For instance, how people need access to free internet without government censorship. Please help us to achieve this. How people also need to connect with the rest of the world to resist government imposition. I I urge you to rethink our global strategy for freedom of speech and to take concrete steps to support free expression and civil society. I say this again because it matters. We are all this in together, and helping freedom of democracy in Iran and our region is also good for your own security. We need more than words, we need real actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rahmani. Thank you for these powerful words, and thank you for our audience to staying a bit longer than planned. Thank you very much.